If you are going to stand there, at least try not to distract people who actually matter," Charles Bennet said without looking at her, his voice cutting clean through the quiet murmur of the room as if it belonged there more than anyone else did, and the laughter that followed was not loud but sharp enough to settle into the air, the kind that did not need volume to make its point. And Ava Carter stood still beside the long glass table, her tray balanced carefully in both hands, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, as if the words had passed through the room without ever reaching her, and the room itself was polished to perfection, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a skyline that stretched for miles, sunlight reflecting across chrome and marble, every detail curated to reflect power, precision, and control, and at the center of it all stood Charles, confident, composed, moving through his presentation with the ease of someone who had never been questioned, his tailored suit catching the light as he gestured toward the large screen behind him, numbers and projections shifting in clean, organized lines, and the executives around the table leaned forward slightly, their attention fixed, their expressions attentive, reinforcing the rhythm he set, and Ava moved quietly along the edge of the room, placing glasses of water beside each seat with careful, practiced movements, her presence blending into the background in a way that seemed expected, almost required, and as she reached the end of the table, Charles spoke again, this time with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes, commenting casually about how some people were better suited to carrying trays than understanding what was happening in the room, and a few heads turned, not toward Ava directly, but in acknowledgement of the remark, a subtle reinforcement of the invisible line that separated who belonged and who did not. And Ava paused for the briefest moment, her hand hovering just above the table before setting the final glass down with the same precision as the others, and then she stepped back, positioning herself near the wall, her gaze calm, her breathing even, her presence steady despite the attention that had briefly passed over her, and Charles continued without interruption, his voice smooth, confident, outlining a major deal that promised expansion, growth, and a level of success that seemed almost guaranteed in the way he presented it, and the room followed him, each nod, each glance, each note taken reinforcing his authority. And yet beneath that surface, there was something else, something quieter. Something that had not yet revealed itself, and Ava remained where she was. Not leaving, not speaking, simply observing, her eyes moving briefly to the screen, then back to the table, then still again, as if she were listening to something deeper than the words being spoken, and the room continued in its rhythm, controlled, predictable, certain of itself, unaware that within its perfect structure, a single moment was already beginning to take shape, waiting, patient, unseen, just beyond the edge of what anyone in that room believed could change. The room continued to move in the rhythm Charles had set, smooth and uninterrupted, the soft hum of air conditioning blending with the faint tapping of fingers against tablets, and the occasional turning of a page, and Ava remained near the wall, her posture relaxed but attentive, her presence quiet in a way that did not compete with the space, and yet her eyes did not drift aimlessly, they moved with intention. Pausing briefly on the screen where numbers shifted in precise columns, then returning to stillness as if storing something without needing to show it, and Charles spoke with increasing confidence, his voice carrying across the table as he outlined projections tied to quarterly growth, his tone firm and assured as he referenced a key figure that seemed to anchor the entire strategy, and several executives nodded in agreement, one of them even offering a brief comment of approval, reinforcing the sense that everything presented was not only correct but inevitable, and Ava listened without reacting, her expression neutral, her breathing steady, and when she adjusted her grip on the empty tray, the movement was small, controlled, almost invisible, and yet it marked a subtle shift, not in the room, but in her awareness of it, and as Charles advanced to the next slide, the numbers grew larger, more central, highlighted in bold against a clean background, and he emphasized them with a slight forward lean, as if drawing the room closer into his certainty. And Ava's gaze followed that moment, resting on a single line longer than the others, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in doubt, not in confusion, but in recognition. And the room, unaware, continued forward, each person focused on their own interpretation of what they were seeing, each one aligning with the confidence that filled the space, and Ava shifted her weight subtly, the tray now resting against her hip. Her fingers relaxed along its edge, and for a brief moment, her eyes moved from the screen to the reflection of it on the polished table surface, where the numbers appeared inverted, softer, less dominant. And something in that reflection held her attention just a fraction longer, as if it revealed a detail the direct view had not, and she looked back to the screen again, her expression unchanged, but the stillness around her carried a different kind of focus now, something quieter, sharper, and Charles continued without pause, his voice steady, his presence filling the room as he described the outcome as if it were already secured, and no one interrupted, no one questioned, the structure of the moment holding firm, and Ava remained where she was. Not stepping forward, not drawing attention, but no longer simply blending into the background, because beneath her calm exterior, something had already aligned, something small but precise, something that did not need to rush, did not need to announce itself, but was waiting for the exact moment to exist, and the room, confident in its direction, moved closer to that moment without realizing it. The presentation moved forward without hesitation, each slide reinforcing the same sense of certainty that had already settled over the room, and Charles stood at the center of it, his voice steady, his gestures controlled, as if every outcome had already been decided long before anyone else had entered the space, and the executives followed closely, some leaning forward with interest, others nodding in quiet agreement, their attention anchored to the numbers that filled the screen, and Ava remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence still calm and unobtrusive, but her focus had sharpened, her eyes no longer moving between details but fixed now on a single figure that continued to anchor the entire projection, and there was no urgency in her expression. No sign of doubt or confusion, only a quiet clarity that seemed to separate her from the rest of the room, and as Charles emphasized the projected return rate once more, his voice gaining a slight edge of confidence, Ava shifted her weight just enough to step away from the wall, not forward into the center, but into a space where she could be heard if she chose to speak, and the movement was subtle, almost invisible, yet it marked a boundary that had not been crossed before, and for a moment she said nothing, allowing the rhythm of the room to continue, allowing Charles to finish his sentence, allowing the executives to absorb what they believed was a complete picture, and then, in a voice that was calm, steady, and measured, she spoke, not loudly, not to interrupt, but simply to exist within the space, pointing out that the base figure used in the projection did not match the previous quarter's actual closing value, and the room shifted, not dramatically, not immediately, but enough to be felt. As if something small had been placed into a system that had not accounted for it, and Charles paused, just briefly, his expression tightening in a way that suggested more irritation than concern, and a few heads turned, not fully, not openly, but enough to acknowledge that something had been said that did not belong to the usual flow, and Ava did not continue, she did not explain further, she did not defend her statement, she simply returned to stillness, her gaze steady, her posture composed, as if the sentence she had spoken required nothing more, and the room held that moment, suspended between dismissal and recognition, waiting to see whether it would dissolve or expand, and Charles let out a quiet breath, his voice returning with a controlled firmness as he dismissed the comment as a misunderstanding, his tone smooth but edged with authority, and the executives followed his lead, their attention shifting back toward the screen, their posture returning to alignment, but something had already changed, something small yet precise had entered the structure of the room, and even as the presentation continued, that single sentence remained, quiet and unresolved, resting just beneath the surface of everything that followed. The presentation resumed as if nothing had happened, the smooth cadence of Charles's voice returning to fill the room. But the rhythm was no longer as seamless as before, something small had been introduced, something that could not be fully ignored, and although the executives shifted their attention back to the screen, there was a subtle hesitation now, a fraction of a second longer before each nod, a slight delay before each note was written. And Ava remained still, her presence quiet, her expression unchanged, as if she had already stepped away from the moment she had created, and Charles continued, reinforcing his earlier point with more emphasis, his tone slightly firmer, as if control could be reasserted through certainty alone, and for a few seconds, the room followed him again, the structure holding together just enough to appear intact, until one of the executives, seated midway down the table, glanced back at the previous slide, his fingers pausing above his tablet, his gaze narrowing slightly as he compared the figures in silence, and he did not speak, not immediately, he simply leaned back slightly, his eyes moving between the screen and his device, and that small shift did not go unnoticed. Another executive beside him followed the motion, glancing over, then back to the screen, then down again, and the chain reaction began quietly, without announcement, without disruption, just a series of small, independent checks that slowly pulled the room's attention away from Charles and toward the numbers themselves, and Charles noticed, not at first through words, but through the absence of them, the lack of immediate agreement, the slight fragmentation of focus, and his voice continued, but the confidence within it tightened, becoming more deliberate, more controlled, and Ava did not move, she did not look toward the executives, she did not attempt to reinforce what she had said, she simply remained present, her gaze neutral, her posture steady, allowing the room to reach its own conclusion, and the executive who had first paused finally spoke, his voice measured and calm, asking a question that did not challenge directly but required clarification, referencing the same base figure Ava had mentioned, and the room stilled again, this time in a different way, not dismissive, not dismissing, but listening, and Charles responded quickly, his explanation precise, his tone confident, but there was a slight shift now, a need to explain rather than declare, and as he spoke, another executive leaned forward, scrolling through data on his screen, his brow tightening just slightly, and the silence began to deepen. Not empty, but full of attention, full of calculation, and the room that had once followed Charles without question now held a different energy, one that no longer moved in a single direction, and Ava stood at the edge of it all, unchanged, her earlier words still lingering in the space, no longer isolated, no longer dismissed, but now part of a larger awareness that continued to unfold, quietly, steadily, beyond anyone's immediate control. The room did not return to its previous rhythm, it shifted into something slower, heavier, as if every movement now carried weight that had not been there before, and Charles stood at the front, his posture still composed, his presence still commanding, but the ease that had defined him earlier had tightened into something more deliberate, more controlled, and the executives no longer followed him with the same immediate agreement. Their attention divided between him and their own screens, their fingers moving with quiet urgency as they recalculated, cross-referenced, and verified, and the soft tapping of devices began to fill the space in a way that felt louder than any voice, and one by one, their expressions changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, unmistakable ways, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a subtle pause before breathing out, a glance exchanged between colleagues that did not need words to communicate what had been found, and Charles noticed it fully now, not just the shift in attention, but the direction of it, and his voice slowed, not stopping, but losing the seamless flow it once had, as if each word now required confirmation before it could be spoken, and Ava remained exactly where she had been, her posture steady, her gaze neutral, her presence unchanged, and she did not look toward the executives, she did not seek validation, she did not move forward or retreat, she simply allowed the room to reach its own conclusion, and the executive who had first questioned the figure leaned forward again, this time speaking with more certainty, his voice calm but clear as he pointed out the discrepancy in the base value and how it affected the entire projection, and another executive followed, adding a detail, then another, each contribution building quietly on the last, until the error was no longer a possibility but a confirmed reality, and the screen behind Charles, once a symbol of certainty, now held numbers that no longer aligned with the room's understanding, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of realization, full of recalibration, full of a truth that had surfaced without force, and Charles stood still for a moment, his gaze moving briefly across the table, taking in the shift that had occurred, the authority he had carried no longer unquestioned, the room no longer moving in a single direction, and for the first time, his attention moved toward Ava, not as a dismissal, not as an afterthought, but as recognition of the origin of what had changed, and Ava met that moment with the same calm stillness she had held from the beginning, her expression composed, her posture unchanged, offering nothing more and nothing less than what had already been given, and the room remained quiet, no one rushing to fill the space, no one attempting to recover the previous momentum, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone by explanation or confidence, and within that silence, the hierarchy that had once defined the room no longer held the same shape, replaced instead by a quiet, undeniable clarity that settled over everyone present. The silence did not break, it settled deeper, stretching across the room in a way that made every small movement feel deliberate, and no one rushed to speak, no one attempted to redirect the moment, because the clarity that had surfaced did not require explanation, it simply existed, and Charles remained at the front, his posture still upright, his expression composed, but something within that composure had shifted. The certainty that once carried his voice now replaced by a quieter awareness. And he turned slightly toward the screen, not to present, not to assert, but to look, truly look, at the numbers that had once seemed unquestionable, and the reflection of them on the polished table felt different now, less like confirmation and more like evidence, and the executives remained still, their attention no longer divided, no longer searching, because the verification had already been completed. The conclusion already formed, and Ava stood at the edge of the room, her presence unchanged, her posture steady, her gaze calm, as if she had never stepped outside of her role, and yet the weight of the room had shifted around her, not toward her, but because of her, and Charles took a slow breath, not visibly strained, not dramatic, just enough to mark the transition from what had been to what now was, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured, no longer carrying the same forward momentum, but grounded in the reality that had replaced it, and he acknowledged the discrepancy, not with resistance, not with dismissal, but with a controlled clarity that signaled recognition rather than defense, and the room absorbed that shift without reaction, without interruption, allowing the moment to settle fully, and Ava did not respond, she did not move, she did not look for acknowledgement, she simply remained present. Her earlier words now part of the foundation of what the room understood, and as Charles adjusted his stance slightly, stepping away from the center of the screen, the dynamic of the room changed again, not abruptly, not visibly to an outside observer, but unmistakably to those within it. The space no longer organized around a single voice, but around a shared awareness, and the light from the windows softened as clouds passed across the skyline, diffusing the brightness into something more even, more balanced, and the reflections across the surfaces lost their sharpness, becoming warmer, less rigid, and the room, once defined by control and precision, now held something quieter, something more human, where certainty had given way to understanding, and Ava remained still for one final moment before shifting her weight slightly, preparing to move again, not as someone who had changed the room, but as someone who had simply done what was right, and as she turned to continue her work, the silence followed her, not empty, but full, carrying with it the undeniable presence of a truth that had revealed itself without force, without volume, and without ever needing to be repeated. The silence no longer belonged to uncertainty, it belonged to understanding, and the room held it carefully, as if any sudden movement might disturb what had just been revealed, and Ava continued toward the side of the room with the same calm pace, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, her tray still balanced lightly in her hands, her expression unchanged. And yet every presence in the room was now aware of her in a way that had not existed before, not as someone who had stepped out of place, but as someone who had been seen clearly for the first time, and Charles remained near the front, no longer centered in the same way, his position unchanged but his presence altered, and his gaze followed Ava briefly, not with judgment, not with dismissal, but with something quieter, something closer to recognition, and he did not speak immediately, allowing the space to hold what had already been said. And the executives shifted slightly in their seats, their posture more relaxed now. Not in comfort but in honesty, the tension that had once pushed everything forward replaced by a stillness that allowed thought to exist without pressure, and one of them closed his tablets slowly, not as a signal of ending, but as acknowledgement that the moment had already reached its conclusion, and another leaned back, exhaling softly, the sound almost blending into the silence, and Charles turned his attention back to the table, his hands resting lightly against its edge, his shoulders no longer rigid, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different tone, not reduced, not weakened, but grounded, shaped by the awareness that now existed in the room, and he addressed the projection again, not as a declaration of certainty, but as something to be reconsidered, something that required adjustment, and no one interrupted, no one rushed to respond, because the authority of the room had shifted from a single voice to a shared understanding, and Ava reached the far side, placing the empty tray down with the same quiet precision she had always used, her movements consistent, unaffected by the change that had unfolded. And she did not look back, did not wait, did not seek acknowledgement. Because what had happened did not belong to her as a moment of victory, it existed simply as truth, and the room remained in that softened stillness, the light from the windows diffused now across the surfaces, reflections gentler, less defined, as if even the environment had adjusted to the shift, and Charles straightened slightly, not reclaiming control, but accepting a new balance, and his gaze moved once more across the room. Not leading, not directing, but observing, and for a brief moment. His eyes met Ava's again, and there was no exchange of words, no visible gesture, only a quiet recognition that passed between them, subtle and complete, and then the moment moved forward, not with the same force as before, but with something steadier, something more real, as the room continued, no longer driven by assumption, but shaped by what had been seen, what had been understood, and what could no longer be ignored. The room did not return to what it had been, it moved forward in a quieter, more deliberate way, as if every decision now carried the memory of what had just unfolded, and Charles stood with a different stillness, no longer positioned as the unquestioned center, but as part of the space he had once controlled, and his attention shifted between the screen and the people around the table, not to lead them, but to understand the direction they were now taking together, and the executives began to speak again, not all at once, not with urgency, but in measured tones, offering adjustments, recalculations, and alternative paths that reflected a shared awareness rather than a single narrative. And the discussion, though calm, carried a deeper weight, grounded in something more real than before, and Ava remained at the edge of the room, her tray now resting lightly on the side table, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture steady and unchanged, and she listened without engaging, her presence quiet, her role unclaimed, and yet the space continued to move around what she had brought into it, reshaping itself without needing to acknowledge her directly, and Charles turned slightly, stepping away from the screen entirely, allowing another executive to take the lead in revising the projections, and that movement, though simple, marked a shift more significant than any words could have expressed, and the room followed naturally, not resisting, not hesitating, as if the transition had already been accepted, and the light outside softened further, the skyline fading into a muted glow as the day moved toward evening, and reflections across the glass and table surfaces blended into something warmer, less rigid, less defined, and Ava reached for her tray once more, lifting it with the same careful balance, preparing to leave the room as she always did once her work was complete, and as she turned, Charles spoke, not loudly, not in a way that commanded attention, but clearly enough to reach her, and the room paused again, not in tension, but in quiet awareness, and he said her presence had been helpful, the words simple, unembellished, offered without performance. And Ava stopped for a brief moment, not turning fully, not stepping forward, just enough to acknowledge that she had heard, and she gave a small nod, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, accepting the words without absorbing them, without allowing them to redefine what had already been. And then she continued toward the door, her footsteps soft against the floor, and no one spoke as she left, the silence returning once more, but this time it was not empty, it was complete, carrying with it a quiet understanding that no longer needed to be explained, and within that silence, the room held its new shape, steady, balanced, and no longer bound by what it had once assumed to be unquestionable. The hallway outside the room felt different as Ava stepped into it, the quiet no longer sharp or empty but softened, carrying a calm that settled naturally into the space, and she moved forward with the same steady pace, her tray balanced lightly in her hands, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as if nothing in the room behind her required reflection or pause, and inside, the conversation continued without her. But it did not return to what it had been, it carried forward with a quieter awareness, each voice measured, each decision grounded in something more careful, more considered, and Charles remained among them, no longer at the front, no longer directing the room with certainty, but participating in it with a presence that felt more balanced, his attention shifting not just to the numbers, but to the people around him, to the space itself. And the light from the windows dimmed slowly as the evening settled over the city, casting a softer glow across the table. Across the screen, across the faces that now held a different kind of focus, and the room, once defined by control and assumption, had become something else, something quieter, something more aware, and Ava continued down the hallway, passing reflections of the room in the glass panels that lined the corridor, the images faint, blurred, no longer sharp enough to capture the exact moment that had taken place. And yet the feeling of it remained, carried forward in the stillness that followed her. And she reached the service area, placing the tray down with the same precise care she had always used, her movements consistent, her routine unchanged, and she did not stop, did not look back, because there was nothing to return to, nothing to reclaim, and the work continued as it always had. Steady and quiet, and back in the room, Charles stood for a moment longer after the meeting had naturally come to a close, the executives gathering their things without urgency, their voices low, their movements unforced, and he remained still, his gaze resting briefly on the empty space near the wall where Ava had stood, and there was no expression of regret, no visible shift that demanded attention. Only a quiet recognition that settled into him without words, and he turned toward the window. Looking out at the city now lit by evening lights, the reflections softer, the edges less defined, and the silence that followed was not the same silence that had existed before. It was not built on distance or control, but on something quieter, something understood, and as he stepped away from the window and left the room, the lights dimmed slightly behind him, the space returning to stillness, but not the same stillness it once held. And somewhere down the hallway, the faint sound of movement continued, steady and calm, blending into the rhythm of the building, carrying forward the quiet presence of a moment that had changed everything without ever raising its voice.